And we are recording episode 791 on Tuesday, April 26th, 2022 at 4:12 p.m. Eastern Time with Mr. Ray McGovern. And we are now one day into the regime of Elon Musk. But Mr. McGovern, for everybody that didn't listen to our last episode, please introduce yourself to them.
Sure. My name is Ray McGovern. I took an interest and majored in Russian in undergraduate way back in 1645, I think it was. And I came down to Washington when John Kennedy appealed for people to ask what they might do for their country and not what their country might do for them. And that may sound very corny now, but it was real. There were a whole bunch of us that came down to Washington at that time. Since I had a background in Russian, after I finished my active duty in the US Army as a infantry intelligence officer, I joined the analytic division of the CIA. I say analytic because we had nothing to do with operations. You people knew as much about operations as I did, reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, which used to print stories about that. Suffice it to say that I ended my career briefing one-on-one top national security officials under Ronald Reagan for his first 4 years. Reagan very rarely, because he liked to sleep in. The briefings I did downtown normally took place around 8:30, 7:30 for Schultz, so forth. That was good duty. I was trusted. I was able to tell it like it was. It was sort of like the halcyon days of CIA analysis. I retired, and then, my God, it was hard to believe. I saw my colleagues deliberately participating in the biggest scam of the century, and that so far, and that was to claim there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That not only that, but Saddam Hussein, that day's boogeyman, was likely to give those weapons of mass destruction to Saddam Hussein, that he was about to give them to terrorists, real terrorists, the ones that knocked down those buildings in New York and hit the Pentagon. Now, there wasn't a piece of evidence about that. It was all well contradicted, and not only by evidence, but by logic. I formed a small group, I co-formed it, I should say, of veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. We like the acronym VIPs, right? Okay. We always told the truth when we were on active duty. And so we never quite met the VIP status in terms of grade and directorship.
Yeah.
But we could look at each other in the eye and say, yeah, we're VIPs now. More seriously, we had been comparing notes using this new form of communication called email. When one of us wanted, like me, wanted to write an article saying Vice President Cheney is lying through his teeth, and I can prove it. You like to check, you like to have a sanity check, right? Like we used to do when we were corporately working, and say, hey, Fred, would you look at this? I think this is what's going out. But okay, we used to do that all the time. And yeah, we published 3 memos for the president, as we usually did before. 3 memos warning Bush that, look, it's a hoax. These guys are deceiving you. And we warned after Powell's speech. How did we put it? We told Mr. President Bush, we advise you to broaden the circle of your advisors beyond those already plumbing for a war for which there is no cogent necessity, and from which the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic, period, end quote. We take no delight in being right about that. It's awful, okay? But it happened. So that started us rolling and critiquing the work of our former colleagues, and there was a lot to critique. More recently, there was the Russiagate business, which, we looked at really carefully, and we saw that, hate to admit it, but Trump was right in saying this was a hoax as well. Now you fast forward to Ukraine, and most recent webcast or whatever that I did, I think I titled it, "It's Not What They're Telling You."
Yeah.
And it's not what they're telling you. And I guess that brings us up to date, except I've grown a little in those years, 20 years of critiquing US intelligence, in particular, policy by extension, does something to you. It not only enlivens you, but makes you look a little bit older.
Yeah. I've had you know, I've had, most notably, I would say, with COVID, I brought, that's why I was permanently banned, was giving platform to Dr. Malone and Dr. McCullough. And as I've said during then and now and for all future episodes, I will always try to hear all sides of an issue so that I can figure out what's going on, because anything you see on the news is, I mean, you're being told it for a reason. Someone's got an agenda. And so I've had on former CIA officials like yourself to talk about Ukraine. I've also had on Ukrainian refugees, and I hear their side. And I've had on bioweapons experts, and I've heard all sides that Russia is justified in doing this because of NATO expansion or because of US biolabs. I've heard the Ukrainian side that this is wanton slaughter and a war of aggression, blah, blah, blah. So I say that to sort of preface this by saying I just want to hear all sides of this, and I want to try to piece it together for myself. And to anybody listening, you can go through all the episodes and piece it together yourself, and maybe we'll come out with similar looking images, or maybe we'll have completely different puzzle pieces. But I think that we cannot shy away from any and all opinions and analyses of it. So I have no agenda going into this. So if it's not what we're being told, Mr. McGovern, what indeed is going on?
Well, let's go back to your talk about whether it's justified. I'll address that in a second. The other adjective used is it was unprovoked.
Hmm.
That is a bald-faced lie. Now, I don't know how much history your viewers would want to hear, but let me just a couple of the highlights, okay? Berlin fell in November. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1987. George H.W. Bush promised Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the president and the foreign secretary of Russia, look, I'm not going to take advantage of that. What you need to do is see my Secretary of State as soon as possible. And they did. James Baker, pretty slick Texas lawyer, not a bad Secretary of State, actually. He shows up in Moscow on the 1st of February, 1990 now. And he says, look, East Europe has fallen apart. We don't want to dance on the Berlin Wall, as President George H.W. Bush had said, but we need to do something to rearrange things. So how about this? How about we have a reunited Germany? And Gorbachev said, wait. Hey, Tom, when I heard they're talking about a reunited Germany, I had the same reaction. My God, I mean, maybe it's too many war films I saw as a kid. But, the whole reason behind NATO was to keep the US in Europe, keep the Soviets out of Europe, and keep Germany divided, for God's sake, so they couldn't do this stuff anymore, okay? Now, I'm just an American, I know something about this stuff, but I can imagine how Gorbachev reacted to that. Now, here's a guy who saw that the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany, that Soviet citizens in the amount of 37 million Putin says 36 million died during World War II. Killed, well, not all of them killed, but and not a lot of them soldiers, of course. How about U.S.? Well, we had, I think, 400,000 soldiers.
425,000.
425,000, yeah. So put yourself in Gorbachev's place. He's, oh, that's really nice. You have a reunited Germany? What's your pro for this quid? And Baker says, oh, he says, how about this? How about we promise not to move NATO 1 inch? That's about this in centimeters, 1 inch closer to you guys in Russia. How about that? Now, long story short, Shevardnadze and Gorbachev went to sleep on it, came back the next day and said, you promise? And Baker said, cross my heart, hope to die, And neither of them had the presence of mind to do what my father, the lawyer, always told me, get it in writing.
Yeah, get it
for God's sake, get it in writing. It was pretty, things would fall apart. They needed U.S. aid. They thought they could get U.S. aid. So sure, cross your heart, hope to die. Okay, well, long story short, that was February 1990. Since then, 14, count them, 14 nations have joined NATO, and they all lie to the east of the East German border at the time. That doubled NATO in size. Okay, now that's 1990. Let's fast forward to 2008. Russia was a shambles after East Europe and Russia fell apart. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Any pretense to take over the rest of the world was gone. There was no capability, much less ideological intention. And so Putin comes in and he starts to rebuild Russia. He starts to rebuild their own forces. And 2008 comes along. So 2008, so first 1990, we're talking about, I think, 18 years. And Putin and the new, at the time, foreign minister, a fellow named Sergei Lavrov, who is making headlines today, call Bill Burns, our ambassador in Moscow. He happens to be the head of CIA right now. They call him in and they say, look, Mr. Burns, and this is what Lavrov, we have, thanks to WikiLeaks, we have the Moscow embassy cable that reports on what Lavrov said to Burns. And this is what he said, Mr. Burns, do you know what "нет" means? And Burns said, oh, yeah, I think it means no, right? Yes, "нет" means "нет," Mr. Burns. There are rumors you're gonna incorporate or invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. We say "нет," that is our red line. Oh, now Burns, to his credit, reports that back to Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And he says, we got to take this seriously because Russia has its own security interests. Russia doesn't want somebody, from NATO on its doorstep. So Russia has its own objectives here. Now, why do I mention that? Because that took a lot of guts. Ambassadors don't usually say that to the Secretary of State if it's against the grain. Forget all about that. That was February 1st. We have the cable. If I've seen one Moscow embassy cable, I've seen about 7,000 in my career. It's authentic. It's from WikiLeaks. They don't lie, all right? So February 1st, 2008, 2 months later, March, April, on April 3rd, NATO declares in a solemn pronouncement at a NATO summit, Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. So the US was thumbing its nose, Bush, Cheney, thumbing its nose at Russia. We don't care about your strategic interests. We don't care. We don't give a rat's patootie about it. The next big thing, of course, is 2014. So 2008, now 2014, when the US and other Western-friendly intelligence services support a coup d'etat, a kind of a putsch right in the middle of Kiev, the head of Ukraine, the capital of Ukraine. Now, how do we know that? Well, it's been called the most blatant coup in history, and for good cause. It was advertised 18 days beforehand on YouTube. Yeah, let me just explain here. The Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, was talking en clair, not corrupted, not encrypted, all right, to our ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, and they're plotting the coup right on the telephone. They're saying who would be the next prime minister. His name was Yats. Apparently, she couldn't pronounce the whole name with Yatsenyuk. Okay, and they're going to put the right sector guys and the real Nazis, not in subordinate but influential posts. They were going to meet the EU concerns on this by just saying what Nuland said. I won't say it all, but she said, F the EU, okay? And then they were going to get this guy, his name was Biden, Joe Biden. They were going to get him in to stitch the whole deal together and give an international personage, the endorsement from the vice president. How do we know that? Nuland says, I talked with Jake Sullivan. Jake, he's the national security advisor right now. Talk with Jake Sullivan, who of course is the national security advisor to the vice president Biden, and he says Biden's ready to come in. He'll glue the whole thing together. So that's in the intercepted conversation. When did that appear on YouTube? On the 4th of February, 2014. Now, I've never seen the like of it. I mean, I said, well, poor Yats, poor Yats, and he'll never become prime minister of Ukraine. The whole thing is blown. And, I dare think that Putin thought the same thing, because he was in Sochi at the Winter Olympics and he stayed there. The coup was blown. So wasn't that interesting? Well, what happens? On the 22nd, so my arithmetic is right, 18 days later, there's the coup. And Putin hurries back the next day and has to decide what he's going to do about the prospect of Ukraine, as Yatsenyuk has already proclaimed, will become part of NATO, that Russian will be banned as an official language. That's big, okay? And so Putin meets with his advisors and he says, my God, can you conceive of the fact that NATO would take over our only warm water, our only year-round ice-free naval base, Sevastopol in Crimea? No, we can't allow that. Long story short, they had a plebiscite. Big majority voted to rejoin Russia. They did get the annex. Nobody's in favor of annexation, but suppose it happened in Newport or Long Beach, California. So anyhow, so there was where it stood in February 2014. Now, the next thing one has to remember is the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner MH17, and that was on July 17th, 2014. So February, March, you do the math, a couple months later. Now, John Kerry, our Secretary of State, got up not immediately, 3 days later at all the Sunday talk shows. This was shut down by the Russian separatist. It's a Russian missile. Okay, he said, we have imagery, we have trajectory, we know exactly where that thing was shot from and it hit the thing, and we know exactly what went. Well, guess what? Kerry's record, for telling the truth, is not very good. On this one, I conclude, on the basis of really good circumstantial evidence, that he was lying. Now, why do I say that? What gives me the qualifications to say that? Well, I know enough about US intelligence collection capabilities to know that that period in time, All our fancy collection mechanisms are focused right down there, laser-like, on that part of Ukraine, okay? In other words, I'm 90% sure that we know exactly what happened. Do we have trajectory? Do we have imagery information? I'm sure we do. Does it say what John Kerry said it said? No. Why? Because Kerry has been, the US has been unwilling to share that information, even with a court proceeding that's going on now in The Hague, where 2 people are accused of shooting the plane down. So yeah, was it a Soviet-made missile? Yeah, it was. It was given to the Ukrainians a decade earlier, and nobody knows that. But the US used this as the pretext to persuade the Europeans to impose really, really stringent sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. In other words, the annexation of Crimea didn't work for that. It wasn't quite bad enough. But once you could blame the Russians for killing 298 passengers on a ship, on an aircraft, that held. And so the Europeans were persuaded to cut off their noses to spite their face, to impose sanctions that hurt them as much as it hurt Russia. And then we started going down that path all along. Now, to bring us up to the present case here, that was 2014. How about 2021, last year? Well, what happened last year? Well, Biden came into office, and trying to gauge where he stood on these things, how much an adroit politician or negotiator he was. I was watching in some amazement when the first thing he did was let himself be mousetrapped. I don't know. Maybe it was deliberate. But George Stephanopoulos, one of the big neocon interviewers, is now Mr. President Biden. Do you think Biden? Do you think Putin's a killer? And Biden, oh yeah, he's a killer. Okay. Next week, these 2 amateur diplomats, Jake Sullivan, the above mentioned, and this fellow named Blinken, Tony Blinken, go out to Anchorage to meet with their Chinese opposite numbers, and they insult the hell out of them. They say, no, we have a rules-based orders that you're going to have to follow. And the Chinese look at them and say, who the hell do you think you are? Quote, you're not qualified to talk to us in that tone. Okay, so that's the end of March. Now, what else happened then? We have the head of Ukraine, the fellow name is Zelensky. He's grabbing a lot of headlines now. He says on the 24th of March, look, we're going to take back Crimea. We're going to take back the Russian-speaking provinces. And if it takes a military assault to do that, we're up to that. That was the 24th of March last year. Huh. So Biden's foreign policy team is off and running in a very strange direction, right? Okay. So what happens next? On the 25th of March, Russian troops start pouring toward the Ukrainian border. And they start massing there, the tens of thousands of them. And finally, Biden calls Putin and says, hey, let's have a little telephone call. And that happened. That happened on the 13th of April last year, okay? So Biden says, there seem to be a lot of Russian troops going toward Ukraine. What's going on? And Putin says, well, yeah, actually, there are a lot. As my defense minister said yesterday, would you believe 2 full armies and 3 airborne sophisticated units? Would you believe that? And besides, this fellow Zelensky has to be reined in because he's not going to take back any Crimea or any other parts of what we've supported in Ukraine. Now, Mr. President, another thing, Would you please, Mr. President Biden, would you please call those two very sophisticated warships that are on their way into the Black Sea? Would you stop them and turn them around? Because we don't need that kind of provocation right now. Now, Biden tells the Navy, turn those ships around, have them visit Greece. And then Biden says to Putin, let's have a summit. Let's have a summit. We need a summit. And Putin says, all right. So on June 16th, they have a summit. Now, what came out of the summit? We don't know a lot. It doesn't seem it went really well, but we do know what Biden explained happened at the summit that same evening. He's getting on the plane. They're trying to drag him on the plane. Joe, come on now. He said, no, I want to talk to Professor Mark. He says, and this is a quote. He says, it's not appropriate to say what I told Putin, but I think Russia has this big problem. A big problem. I mean, it's very worrying to them. They're being squeezed by China. They have this long, several thousand miles border with China. That they know that China is aspiring not only to be a major economic power, but a major military power. My God, Putin's got a lot to contend with. He's being squeezed by China. Biden's words, okay? Then they finally get him on a plane. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Putin met with his advisors that evening and said, did you hear what Biden is saying about us being squeezed? But yeah, we're being squeezed in a fraternal embrace, for God's sake. We have to educate this guy. I don't know who's telling them that the Chinese and we are at loggerheads. That was true 5 decades ago.
Yeah.
Are they still reading out of that textbook? Okay. So just to finish this up.
No, you're fine.
Putin and Xi spend the rest of the year trying to show Biden and his advisors, if they're educable, that the alliance, that what they call the strategic relationship between China and Russia, is higher, more intense, exceeds is the word in Russian, a traditional alliance. That they will come to each other's aid in many ways. And they do that in a personal conversation, which they advertise, that is Putin and Xi, in December of last year. And then getting close to this year, Putin says, thanks for your invitation to the Beijing Olympics. I'll be there. Now that was already after Biden said, no, we're going to boycott the Olympics.
Yeah.
So now here's the key. The situation in Ukraine has already heated up again, starting in the fall. Biden has seemed very concerned about that, but the Ukrainians are making all kinds of trouble, and there's fairly good evidence that they were about to attack Donetsk and Lugansk, where the Russian speakers and some of them Russian citizens have persisted since 2014. So Putin goes up to Beijing and witnesses the beginning of the Olympics. And then he says to Xi, now, everything I've told you up till now, I can substantiate, I can show you with evidence. What I'm going to say now is the way I reconstruct what Putin said to Xi, because this is really important, okay? This is a change. It's a big change in the world correlation of forces. He says, best friend Xi, I don't know how to tell you this, but the Americans and NATO are not paying much attention. I'm afraid that the Ukrainian forces are massed. They're already massed on the borders of Lugansk and Donetsk. I'm afraid they're going to invade. I think I may have to invade Ukraine to prevent that and just to denazify the whole thing and to the extent I can demilitarize. What do you think? Now, this is the key, okay? I want you to think about this. Here's Xi, president of China, whose principled stand has always been non-interference in the affairs of other countries. I mean, it's 1648. What was the name of that place in Germany where the Westphalia Agreement? Countries don't attack other countries, okay? Now, Beijing's bedrock principle is that. So what did Xi say when Putin said, we're going to invade Ukraine? My guess is he said, you mean after the Olympics, right? And Putin, oh yeah, after the Olympics. The Olympics ended on the 20th of February. On the 21st, those two republics who always wanted to be recognized as independent were recognized as independent by Putin and the Russian leaders. And a couple of days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, I don't favor countries invading other countries. I think it's a really bad idea.
Sure.
But I never thought that Xi would give his blessing to that. And that was one of the disincentives I thought Putin was laboring under, because, you know, this is the whole deal here. If China's behind us, we can do a lot of stuff. And if you're not sure China's behind you, you're really pretty reckless in going ahead. And I was wrong. And I think the reason I was wrong is that Xi, contrary to all the expectations of my Chinese friends, my Chinese analyst friends, who said, no, Xi would, they still say, no, Xi would never approve of that. Contrary to those expectations, Xi gave his nihil obstat, or his imprimatur, and said, well, you mean after? So that's how I reconstruct it. And I think everything that's happened since, with the Chinese full diplomatic support for Putin, and supporting him at the UN and elsewhere, persuading even rivals like India to abstain on these resolutions. What you have is a cleavage now in the world. People say, well, the unipolar world is gone. That's true. They talk about a multipolar world. Well, I would say bipolar. I would say the West, by the way, the white West, okay?
Yeah.
And Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Brazil, South Africa, even Saudi Arabia, for God's sake, the people of color, East. Now, are Russians people of color? Well, they certainly have been treated that way, right? They've been blackened so much. I think we can consider them people of color.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to take so long, but you know, I think you need a little context here, and it's not that I think it's a good idea what happened in Ukraine. What I'm saying is that if you follow my factual rundown, and you can forget what I said about what happened in Beijing on the 4th of February, if you want, and that's speculation. But if you look at all these facts, you cannot in good conscience say that the attack on Ukraine was unprovoked. That's a lie.
Yeah. Mr. McGovern, I'm going to use the restroom. Can you tell everybody where to find you online?
Yeah, sure.
And then we'll get back to the analysis.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I can be found on raymcgovern.com. Pretty simple. And it's nice that Tom remembered to mention that, because my webmeister, who happens to be my son, when he sees me do a little webcast or a Zoom like this, and finds out that I forgot to mention our website, I get into a lot of domestic trouble. Even though he lives far away, he gets pretty angry if I forget to mention the website. Now I'm also on Twitter. It's at Ray McGovern. What else? Instagram. I'm on Facebook. But I would suggest that you go to YouTube. If you'd like a more academic portrayal of how things evolved since 2008 in particular. 2008 is when Lavrov said "niet" means "niet" about Ukraine admission into NATO. If you want that kind of treatment, Go to YouTube and search on John Mearsheimer, Mearsheimer. He and I did a web thing together. I think it was on the 4th of February. Anyhow, you'll find it. It's got over 1 million hits. I don't know if they stopped counting when you hit 1 million. Maybe when you hit 2 million, they count again. And it wasn't McGovern that was the draw. Mearsheimer is the dean of the School of Realism in International Relations. Now, I've been away from academe for quite some time, but I noticed that this School of Realism that Mearsheimer is pretty much the prime example of is also called offensive realism. And I'll tell you why I think it's probably got some academic meaning that I haven't even looked at. But what I think today it means, offensive realism, is what John Mearsheimer and I agree on. And again, he's got a better and long academic reputation, better than mine. But here's what it is, okay? To Russia, to Putin, Ukraine is an existential threat. Never mind the Nazis, never mind the Ukrainian army. There was a realistic prospect that the US would put in missile bases in Ukraine, just as they have in Poland and in Romania, which would give Putin something like 5 to 6 minutes to decide whether he was under a nuclear attack, okay? So it's not only that, but the Russian early warning system sucks. Okay, it's not really very good. Okay, so 4 minutes, so they would have to automate their retaliatory capability. I don't think we want that, and Putin doesn't want that either. So yeah, so that's the strategic side of things. So what does that mean? If it's a existential threat, then Putin has to win. Whoa, he has to win. He can't lose. Yeah. So next question, can he win?
Yeah. I was going to say, to that, on a side note, I was going to say, I cannot get Mr. Mearsheimer to respond to my emails. So I've been trying to get him on here for 2 years. Yeah. But what you said about that, Ukraine is their Cuba. It's their Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. And that's important because that's the comparison. You'll recall, many of you won't recall. I recall it quite well. September, October 1962, okay? I had been commissioned U.S. Army Intelligence, Infantry Intelligence. I reported to duty at Fort Benning, Georgia on the 3rd of November, 1962. All spit and polish, ready to do my 2 years, okay? I was in ROTC, and there were no weapons there. I mean, hello. Some of us were really interested in these new, sophisticated grenade launchers. Had just been invented. Man, we want to shoot this thing, There weren't any. There weren't even any 155 millimeter howitzers, which are now going into Ukraine. Where were they? Well, some sergeant finally said, look, sorry, guys, they're in Key West, right opposite Cuba. They're ready to go in.
Yeah.
They were ready to go in. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just died down. That's how close we were. Now, that was an existential threat to the United States, okay? And what do? We faced Khrushchev down. We said, look, not only we're not going to allow you to put those things in there, but we're smart enough to know you need something too, like the quo for quid pro quo. So the quo is our missiles in Turkey. We'll take them out, but let's not talk about that, okay? We don't want to be giving in to your blackmail, right? So they worked it out. They worked it out because it was an existential threat. So, Tom, you're right in pointing out that that's the analogy. The Russians look at our sites there in Poland and Romania. The one in Romania is finished. The one in Poland is almost finished. These are described as anti-ballistic missile sites.
Yeah, ABM sites.
But the experts tell me, and I know the good experts, you put a CD into these machine, and you change them to an offensive missile overnight.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's me that's me going, this is my self-defense gun. Well,
yeah,
I could also just make it
yeah,
the offense gun.
yeah. So let's just finish up. Existential threat, and so Putin must win. Now, just one side note here. People say, well, what about whataboutism? What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? Well, we didn't have to win those. We lost those and went home. Yeah, you know why? Because they were no existential threat to us, for God's sake.
Yeah.
That was a war of choice. No term in my lexicon. Now it's used all the time. A war of choice, both of them. So it's really important if you can lose and go home. In this case, Putin must win. Now, next question. Can he win? Well, that's where I go back to my frame of reference here. Yeah, he can win, barring some stupid nuclear device set off. He can win, the more so because he's got a big brother in Xi Jinping, president of China. If my analysis is correct, and I think everything since the invasion bears that out, China is foursquare behind Putin. And if Putin runs into real trouble, you're going to see a lot of trouble in the South China Sea and across from Taiwan. And the US military is not prepared to deal with a two-front war. And so that's when you would get these people at the Pentagon saying, well, now, Mr. President, I think we've shown our resolve here. And, until we build 18,000 more ships out there for the Seventh Fleet, the Chinese are going to embarrass us out there. So Putin's got an ace in the hole is what I'm saying. And I'm really surprised that not too many people say that I seem to be a lone voice out there. But, just to finish up here, I started my career under John Kennedy analyzing Sino-Soviet relations, relations between the communist regimes in China and the one in Moscow, and they hated each other. Yeah. The total trade turnover was 100 to 200 million dollars a year. They were fighting each other across the border. They were claiming parts of other people's countries. I mean, it was really, really serious. Now, could we persuade policymakers that this was real? No. Most of them said, no, you've been taken in, you analysts. They've been taken in by the propaganda. They don't hate each other. They're both commies, for God's sake. They're both commies. This is the international communist movement, And then our satellites found 15 divisions, 15 well-equipped Soviet divisions right on the Chinese border. And then they grew to 40. And finally, we could persuade Nixon and Kissinger this was a real problem and they could take advantage of it. Yeah. And they did. We could talk about that later. The point is that, when you're an analyst and you go from one frame of reference and then you see things changing and you watch, for example, the turnover in trade now, it's approaching probably next year. The next year would be 200 billion with a B. Okay. So it was, I asked my son, who's a math major, I said, well, what's that? How many times is 2 billion? It's 1,000 times, right? So even though I'm not very good at math, I know what that means. So they're like this now. We push them together. It's a testament to Blinken and Nod and now Blinken and Sullivan, that they came out of this ivy tower, sort of ivy draped thing that we could talk down to the Chinese and take advantage, as Kissinger and Nixon did back in the day, of real squeezing by China. I mean, this is very unrealistic. And I do hope I do hope that the Chinese don't have to stir up real trouble. The prospect of a clash out in Asia to give these young fellows that work for Biden some sense of proportion and some sense of danger that they run in pushing Putin back in Europe, pushing him into a corner. Nothing good is going to happen pushing Putin into a quarter. And so when I look at NBC, by the way, you may hear some, we're having a thunderstorm. I'm not a CNN expert there reporting from Lviv, or, I'm anyhow, when you see Biden and the rest of them saying, oh, we're going to fight this thing to the last Ukrainian, and Zelensky, Zelensky's not his own man. He's got to answer not only to the US, but to the neo-Nazis that would do him in at the first sign of weakness. And so who's suffering? It's the poor Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
We ought to be aware of that and do everything we can to get an immediate ceasefire, and then to kind of piece together what should happen to Ukraine after denazification and demilitarization. And NATO's got to come to its senses. Lavrov is warning them, look, nuclear things are not out of the question. Tom, I'm really upset at that because that is new. Soviet leaders didn't do that. Russian leaders didn't do that right up till now. What is it a token of? It's a token of how deeply the Russians feel about all these weapons pouring into Ukraine. And they can say, and they can accomplish this. They can say, we're going to destroy those weapons as soon as they come in.
Yeah.
But over the longer term, if the US keeps manufacturing new weapons and feeding the industry and so forth, they keep putting them in, something bad's going to happen over the longer or even over the midterm. So Lavrov is pulling out all the stops here and saying, look, nuclear is closer now than it has been in a long time. It's worse. And Mearsheimer and Lavrov agree on this. It's worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we talked about that a little while ago.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's maybe why, because hasn't the Biden administration, although sending aid, aren't they kind of dragging their feet a little bit with the aid and the weapons?
Well, I haven't heard that.
I got that from
evidence of that.
Well, I got that from Claire Lopez. She was a CIA analyst for 20 years. And I think she said it I have her on every Thursday. It's last week or the week before. And she was saying it as a critique, saying that they're not delivering him fast enough. But that got me thinking, could there be a logic behind that, in that we're trying to have our cake and eat it too? That's if this is true, that we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. We're trying to show the world, hey, we stand with Ukraine, but at the same time, we're like, hey, Russia's not playing around. This is not the thing to. That's my thoughts on that. But then the other angle, you could say, I mean, do the Joint Chiefs, do they want a new and renewed Sino-Russo bloc so that we can have a Cold War? Because we got NATO tightening up now. They're all starting to realize, oh, wait, invasions do happen. They're now all kind of ponying up. Trump wanted them to all pay more, and now they actually kind of are. It kind of seems like, just looking at it with no agenda and no opinion, if you just examined it, it seems like there's a coalescing into a NATO American bloc and a Sino-Russo bloc, which seems like we're kind of going right back to like late 1940s. Seems like we're going Cold War part. Seems like we're going for another dance. I mean, right? We got another space race. China wants to go to the moon. We got the new hypersonics, or the hypersonics are the new Sputniks, right? We've got the creation of the Space Force, right? I mean, Air Force created in 1947. I'm looking at it and I'm like, I've seen this one before. Like and obviously this is all just my inexperienced analysis, but it seems like, whether people want it or not, it seems like we're going into another Cold War. I mean, a fully fledged. People have been saying, oh, we've been in a Cold War for a while. No, I mean like a real, like, Iron Curtain Part 2. Do you think there's any
Well,
accuracy to that, or is that just wild speculation?
well, Tom, my first comment would be that you're too young to have that longer perspective on things. I thought I was the only one to go back to World War II, right?
Oh,
Now
we're all the way
there are
back to the Berlin airlift. We're right back to the Berlin airlift. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen.
yeah,
It's probably gonna be like Taiwan or something, where we're gonna have to airlift in supplies to Taiwan.
ain't going to happen. Uh, I, let me just put it this way: historical analogies are very helpful sometimes.
Sure.
Uh, Things change so much that, in other respects, they're not quite as so helpful. With respect to what the analyst that you mentioned, what is it? Lopez, is it?
Claire Lopez. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know her or of her, but I don't think there's any evidence that we're slow walking this thing.
Okay.
Uh, the reality is that the Russians told us 10 days ago that if we could put all more stuff in there, they're going to bomb it. They're going to just, well, they didn't say that. They said that there'd be unforeseen consequences. And of course, they have been bombing that stuff. They've been bombing the warehouses. They've been bombing every place where those weapons accumulate. Can they continue to do that? They certainly can. So, to the degree that there has been an impediment of the flow of these things, I think it's explainable by the fact that, once they get over the border from Poland or Hungary or wherever, Romania, they're going to get blown up. And not only that, but as you probably remember, yesterday there were strikes on key railway terminals. So how are they going to? This stuff needs to be, a lot of it, the heavy stuff, the howitzers. And when I heard 155 millimeter howitzers, well, that's what we were training on at Fort Benning, and that was 1962. Now, I'm sure, I'm sure they have improved on them since then, but that's not the top flight. That's not the latest howitzer, I duly hope. Okay. Anyhow, to get those things in, you need railways, and they are, of course, very vulnerable. And witness the fact that 5 of those key railway installations were bombed yesterday, right after Biden and what's his name, Austin, our defense
Lloyd Austin.
secretary, left. That was really a bizarre sort of thing. Well, let me comment on that.
Okay.
On Sunday, as it was, we had all these. Well, on Saturday we had Zelensky saying, "I guess it's no secret, but Secretary of State Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin are going to come see me tomorrow." On Sunday, everybody's saying, "Whoa!" They asked the Pentagon, no comment. Asked the White House, no comment. Asked the State Department, no comment. So I didn't know what to believe, and I tweeted my speculation. And again, this speculation, but it's helpful, I think, to speculate. I said, I think this may be Zelensky trying to force the hand of Biden and Austin. Maybe they said, well, maybe we'll come on Sunday, but well, now you announce it. You gotta go, right? So, well, maybe that was right, because after the blackout of news, there were reports from Poland, not from Ukraine, that Austin and Biden had met with Zelensky for 3 hours or so, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, what did that amount to? Well, it amounted to showing how delicate it is to fly into Kiev. I mean, Boris Johnson may be the last guy able to do that. Okay. They came in by train. Okay. They must have flown into some place in Poland. They probably put on a disguise or something, got in these trains, making a disguise up. But if maybe they got to Kiev, I don't know. But in any case, what does that tell you? What did it tell you? I think, and again, this is speculation, I think the Russians, as soon as they heard Zelensky say these guys are coming, they probably told the White House, this is a really lousy idea. This is a very there will be unforeseen consequences. This is a very bad idea. And, by the way, you better not try to come in by plane. We've got you covered in a way that you don't want to be covered if you come in by plane. And so they came in the stealth of night by train, and then they took the train right back into Poland, where they gave this big press conference. What does that tell you? Within hours, the Russians bombed these rail terminals. No more coming in by train, guys. This is going to stop. So my point is this: I take no delight in the violence that's going on in Ukraine, but there's a difference. I mean, Ukraine is right next to Russia. It's an existential threat to Russia, the way NATO has been proceeding. China agrees with Russia's concern here. Hello, why can't you, you don't know why all Biden's foreign policy advisors have droopy shoulders and flat foreheads? Because when they ask a question, naive question, you tell them the answer, and they say, I don't know, and then they go, that's right, that's right. That's a joke. That's speculation.
Yeah, you could kind of sum it up with with excuse my French, but it seems Russia's not fucking around. That's the difference, is where you have one can of beans and I have 10,000 cans, right? And it's the storm, whatever. We're both in our respective homes. And I don't really need your one can. I kind of want it. I'm making this analogy up right now. It's your only can. You're not pulling out any stops. You're loading the 12 gauge and you're like, hey, there won't be a warning shot. This is my last meal. And I'm coming in there going, I'm dancing around and I'm like, yeah, but I kind of want your one can. There's a difference. It's not existential to me. It's existential to Cuban Missile Crisis was, again, the inverse. Existential to us. Russia, that was just an advancing move for them. And it was like, hey, we're going to light the world on fire with thermonuclear warheads if you do this. And it was like, okay, well, no one wins this. How bad do you really want it? Yeah, we'll do the back channel deal with the missiles in Turkey. Allow you to save face. It's the same thing here. Like, hey guys, like they're, it's almost like the Taliban. It's like, well, how can they hold out for 20 years? Because it's their home, it's their land, it's where their fathers, where they have nothing. They have flip-flops and an AK-47. They're gonna fight you to the death. Whereas to us, it's one of like a million conflict zones. We've got 700 bases around the world. We're not willing to go all the way. And Russia is. Is that an accurate analysis of your analysis?
Your analysis?
My analysis of your analysis.
Oh. Okay, I just had one of those at the hospital, so I'm sensitive. Okay, to my analysis. Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. The problem is that during Cuba, John Kennedy was president. He already had it sort of up to here with the CIA and a very corrupt Joint Chiefs of Staff. George Ball, the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, called the Joint Chiefs of Staff a sewer of deceit. They were quite willing to kill Americans and blame it on the Cubans.
Oh,
so
yeah.
they go get Castro.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it's all documented. Yeah. Okay.
General Lemnitzer.
So, yeah, right. I served under
Lemnitzer. Oh, God.
I still see his picture up there on all these walls. Anyhow, what I was about to say, yeah, what makes it different is that John Kennedy was smart enough, compass mentis enough, to make sure that given the military proclivity to nuke all these Russians, and it was there, that he had somebody knowledgeable about Russia at the time, about the Soviet Union, and he picked Tommy Thompson, Llewellyn Thompson, who had been ambassador to Russia and now was back in Washington, who is probably the best expert on Russia except for George Kennan. Okay. Now he said, Tommy, I want you to take part in every one of those meetings we have on Cuba, on what we do. And if memory serves, when a real hardline message came in from Khrushchev saying, look, we're not going to back down on this. Another one came in about the same time, and it was much more conciliatory. He said, okay, now let's talk about how we get out of this. And Thompson said, look, disregard the first one. He's typing this thing out or dictating it with his generals right behind him. No offense, generals. Okay. Take the second one, answer the second one, and I have reasonable expectation that we can solve this thing. And that's what Kennedy did. Now, who's the Llewellyn Thompson now in the White House? Or who's participating? These green people that their only credit is they went to an Ivy League school and think they're just as smart as the best and the brightest that got us into Vietnam, for God's sake. They don't know nothing. People who do know them talk about them being kind of a 30-year-old bunch of punks. Okay, now that's what's advising Biden and Putin. Yeah, Biden and Putin knows that. Okay, so that's the danger. If these guys, with the full support of what I call the Mickey Mat, which is the military-industrial complex in spades, if they think they can go to the brink and that they can maybe fire off a real small little nuclear weapon there in Ukraine or wherever, and the Russians will back down, they're wrong, okay? If they think they can, well, there's no indication that they are sensible or that they have somebody with some experience. There are people with some experience around. Unfortunately, the most recent ambassadors to Moscow are a desert in terms of thinking straight. So Biden would have to look elsewhere. There are people at academia who could help him, but I don't think he has a prayer. So that's a real danger. And I think Putin knows that better than witness the fact that they told Biden to tell Putin on the 6th of June last year that the Chinese was squeezing Russia. We know about that. We know you got a big problem. Whoa, that was just so stupid because it reflected a complete complete disregard, a complete ignorance of the fact that what the old Soviets used to call the balance of power, the arrangement of things in the world had changed. And it was no longer a triangular relationship, with China, Russia, and the US. And now it was, if you remember geometry, now it was an isosceles triangle, right? With two big arms, and then the short end of the stick is the US, okay? And the fact that they don't recognize that, or that they think they can stir up things in places like Ukraine to the merriment of Lockheed and Raytheon. I mean, look, what happens to all those weapons that they're destroying? Oh, they have to be replaced. They're making money hand over fist. So that's the problem that Putin sees. And even if he's able to denazify and demilitarize, let's say the part of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, that's going to be a long-term problem until they get some sort of regime in to keep the two sides apart. The river itself won't be enough. And there you have Odessa and places that are a little bit west of the Dnieper as well. So it's going to be a sticky wicket, even if Putin is able to achieve most of his aims. Now, let me just point out one thing, and that is that the real danger now is that Americans have been persuaded that the Ukraine is winning. They push the Russians back The Russians are not going to be able to achieve their aims. They've lost. Now, what happens when the Russians succeed in consolidating their hold over the southern part of Ukraine and block Ukraine from any access to the Black Sea? My notion, and I get this from military experts I trust, is that they'll be able to do that. What about Odessa? I don't know what they'll do about Odessa, but so let's say they do that and they secure Donetsk and Lugansk. Okay. What is the Washington Post and the New York Times going to say then? Doesn't look like the Ukrainians are winning anymore. Russia's winning. We've got to shove some more arms in there. We've got to do even more to help poor Zelensky. Well, yeah, that's going to be a tough thing for people to backtrack on, and that will just compound the problem, in my view.
Now, is there any evidence that it's also existential for us? If we have biolabs there doing things we're not, again, speculation, doing things we're not supposed to be doing, it could be existential for us, and we're not showing that at all, or you and I don't know that, which is kind of a BS justification, because then you could argue anything and just say, well, we don't know for sure, which is, you can't do that. If you're a major news outlet, you can, but no, we won't do that. But I mean, we do know that we have like 33 biolabs there. Maybe we were doing something that we weren't supposed to be doing. And if that's the case, we really can't have those things being exposed. And so it might be existential for us more so than Iraq or Afghanistan. We're like, we can't have that. And maybe Putin knows that. And maybe we're playing this game. Maybe we're trying to act like it's not existential, hoping Putin doesn't know. Maybe Putin knows. And maybe he's just like, well, I guess if you guys don't care about Ukraine, I'll take it. And, we're like smiling, but like, please, God, don't do that. Do you think there's any grain of truth in that? Or is that just, are we fake news?
Well, I think that you need to ask these questions. But, I don't see the revelations that have already occurred, by the way. The Russians have the documents, for God's sake.
Yeah.
They may even have some of the stuff. They can't get anybody to pay attention. You remember when they said, well, let's have an investigation? Okay.
Yeah.
And then the next day, the head of the UN Security Council happened to be a Brit. The ambassador so-and-so said, no, we're not going to have an investigation. So, I mean, the Russians complain, well, that violates the rules that we abide by the UN. And again, the attitude was, we have our own rule-based order. We in the United States, your rules, we don't care. UN rules, come on, that's passe, okay? So I don't think there's much, the existential is existential. I think that could be a role, but I don't think it would play heavily into US calculations. The kind of existential threat that, for example, John Mearsheimer points out that the US faces is the existential threat to the Democratic Party.
Sure.
Now, if you could say Putin has to win, but you can also say Biden has to win from a political point of view, not because there's an existential threat, but politics runs things. And Putin is well known for saying that US foreign policy is hostage to domestic political requirements. So Putin knows that. He's been had lots of times by these presidents, okay? And I can prove it. So what about Biden? Well, here's Putin. I don't care. It doesn't matter what McGovern thinks about Biden. What matters is what Putin thinks about Biden.
Yeah.
He's observed them up close. He's talked with them in person on June 16th. He's talked by telephone. None of that came out very well. And now we have a Biden that really has not distinguished himself as being fully compass mentis. So here's Putin. I'm Putin. I'm looking on at this. So who's pulling the strings here? We thought the Pentagon would be more sensible. And here we have the defense secretary saying that no, they're out to weaken us. They're out to make sure we can't do anything like Ukraine anymore. I mean, so who do? Well, the point is that Putin can't be sure of anything. Okay, and he can't be sure that they. Well, here's an idea. Wag the dog. Now, let me do a little speculation, okay? This is not based on much fact. And there is a fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc. After something, therefore, because something. Here's what I'm suggesting. Russian media, official media, replayed the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop the day after they were divulged in the United States, okay? And they were pretty damning, and they damned not only Hunter, but Daddy, okay? Joe Biden himself. Now, it was the next day after the Russians had divulged that and made a big stink about it, that Biden said, Putin has to be, he can't stay in power any longer. Now, that was not part of his speech. It was sort of an emotional thing. And, it was, by most standards, that was a faux pas extraordinaire, right? But he said it. So what made him say that? Well, now they're going after my family, Now, if Hunter's laptop had not been obscured and shunted away before the election last year, God knows who would have won. I mean, the press put a lid on that.
Yeah.
YouTube and the others, they knocked off Twitter or whatever. They knocked off the New York Post. And I mean, it was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Nobody said a word for a whole month. Okay. So what happens now? Why is the press finally saying, well, yeah, we were actually the authentic, all these things? Well, all I'm saying is that Bill Clinton, when it was revealed that he was fooling around with Monica Lewinsky, first thing he did was bomb a so-called chemical factory in Sudan, was it? Yeah, okay. So, that pales in significance to what's going on in Ukraine. But what I am saying is that what McGovern pieces together is not as important as what Putin's advisors are telling him.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they pointed out to him, look, it just took a day before Putin says you should be removed, right after we talked about the contents of the laptop. So Biden is a human being. Apparently, he loves his son Hunter to death. And these emotions sometimes play into these things. Witness the speech that he made in Poland the day after. So I'm suggesting that whether it's true or not, whether it's a good line of speculation, Putin is probably being advised that, look, this is what Clinton did. This is what other presidents have done. Domestic problems, domestic politics, as you rightly point out, Mr. Putin, are the determinant of foreign policy. Foreign policy is, as you say, hostage to domestic developments in America. So we have to plan for the worst. And I think that this accumulation of concerns, the non-compos mentis part, the junior advisors who don't get it, the dog in the manger, wag the dog thing, this complex of issues probably accounts for what Lavrov thought he had to say today, and saying, nukes are very much in the picture, and this is crazier or more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my friends, that's saying something.
Yeah.
Lavrov knows about that. So do I. So do you, Tom, even though you weren't even alive then, probably. So that's big, and we have to really kind of educate one another, and that's why I always welcome a chance to talk with you, Tom. so people can tell their friends where to look for real information. And I'll shamefacedly say raymcgovern.com is where you look. And my son says, if you don't get it, you don't get it.
Yeah, yeah. I was born 28 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I certainly wasn't alive. But it does seem, yeah, in a sense, could it be existential for Joe Biden politically, right? I
Yeah.
mean, want to be a wartime president if things aren't going so hot domestically, inflation, border crisis. I mean, maybe, maybe a nice little skirmish over in Ukraine looks good. And I'm a hardline president. I'll do what needs to be done. And it's not that it's even last fall. It's also 2022. It's not even the presidential, but he's got to save face for all that. Yeah, I don't know. Now, could it also be the reason why we are being let's again, as you said, there are limitations to historical analogies because things do change so rapidly. Um, could it be the reason why we are seemingly acting irrational towards Ukraine when it's like, hey guys, this is existential for them? Could it be that this is a modern take on domino theory? Like if you and I were doing this podcast back in the 1940s, we might be like, hey, why does America care so much about Berlin? What do they care? And it's because you have to draw the line. And this, not saying that I even agree with them, I'm just saying, like, let's just use that line of thinking. Like, why do we care about Korea? Why do we care about Vietnam? So much of it was we can't let communism to take hold. Could it be something along the lines of, if we completely roll over, then what precedent is set for China and Taiwan or future Russian expansion? Could it be
Mhm.
something along those lines? Is like, we have to put a foot down, not because we care about Ukraine, but it's, if we allow this, what's coming tomorrow? What's coming next week? And eventually we will have to put our foot down. So might as well do it now.
Yeah. Well, Tom, you asked a good question again. And there are people, highly educated people from the Ivy Leagues, who I dare say believe that. Okay. Now, the reality is different. There is not a scintilla of evidence that after the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian leaders, now Putin, wanted to expand into the rest of Europe. Not one scintilla of evidence. Where did the expansion begin? Well, we already went through that. You know,
First
14
NATO.
new nations east of east. So, so there's that. No Russian imperialism anymore. Used to be centuries ago, and it used to be just up until
90.
1990.
Yeah.
But then it fell apart. Okay. Now, in other words, Putin doesn't want to take over the rest of the world. And that's different from the old Soviet Union. At least ideologically, they pretend they need to do that. Okay, now, how about China? China wants to defend the sea lanes that allow it to import oil. China wants to defend itself. China wants to annex or retake Taiwan in due course. But China's doing just very well domestically. Their GNP up until recently is doing just fine. They've always been centered on themselves. Not since, well, that bizarre thing in 1979, I think, where they invaded Cambodia. They haven't invaded anybody. They haven't endangered anybody. Instead, they've been invaded by Japan, by the British, by everybody else. So, you could see them being very defensive and being very particular about preventing the U.S. from building even more bases. The Solomon Islands. How many of your listeners or your viewers know about the Solomon Islands?
Uh,
They're way off Australia. They're even farther off Hawaii. And yet, when China has made a little agreement with them, which might include Chinese military support, oh, the U.S. is up in arms, but that ain't going to stick. The Solomon Island people, unless there's a color revolution pretty soon, have seen the writing on the wall, handwriting on the wall, and said, well, I think we'll let China help us out, not the U.S. So China is very active in that area, but it's in a defensive mode. They don't want to take over the world either. They are going to take over Taiwan. And we sort of agreed to that 30, 40, 50 years ago. So why do these people like Fiona Hill? Who is Fiona Hill? She's a person who studied under, what's his name? The Harvard historian Richard Pipes. Now, he's a Polish Jew, recently deceased, I think, but he, like Zbig Brzezinski, hate the Russians with a passion, have done everything they possibly could to show the Russians are the menace of the world. Pipes was at Harvard. I had a, what do they call it? A university fellowship to study under Pipes when I got out of college in '61. I knew enough about his attitude toward the evil of communism that it was unhinged. And luckily, I didn't go to Harvard. I did a master's degree somewhere else, and I went into the Army as I was required to do. But Pipes is a menace. Now, she stood on the hype. I give her this. I think she's sincere when she says Putin, and she said this in a recent op-ed in the New York Times, Putin is determined to chase the United States out of Europe. And it's as if he's saying, look, you go out there and don't let the door hit your behind as you leave. I mean, her words. So I say, when I give her credit, she probably believes that because that's what she was taught in graduate school. But these people are loonies. And the ambassadors, such as we've had in Russia for the last couple of times, they're really kind of retarded. And so, I mean, quote me on that. I mean,
that's fine. They're retarded.
I'll debate with those guys anytime. But we don't get to debate with those guys. Yeah. And that's part of the problem.
Concerning, and I was going to say, I've had an author on here before, David Vine from, I think, Georgetown. He wrote a book called Base Nation. It's about the United States bases abroad. It's a fantastic listen. But the book, not my interview. The interview was good, but the book is a fantastic listen about just the number of bases and the reach of the American, I guess, power projection mechanisms or apparatus. It does seem right now.
Tom, let me interrupt for a second.
Sure.
There's a red line on my battery here. I'm going to have to plug it in, or else we're going to be shut down. Can I take a minute to do that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll monologue.
Okay.
Yeah. So David Vine kind of points out and then really another book I'm listening to right now called Tomorrow the World. You can really start to see the American empire being laid out post World War I, kind of planning it, and then using post World War II as the opening to sort of take the world, which we largely have. When I look at China, and based on China's own statements, the 2049 plan, or the 100-year plan, which finishes in 2049, it does seem that their big picture is to replace the American hegemon. It is to establish world domination in the same way that we have. So, and that doesn't make, two rights don't make a wrong, but it seems like they want to remove us as the world hegemon so that they can dominate the world's resources. And I guess my logic is, if it's a zero-sum game, I'd rather it be us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you're pretty good, Tom. I have to tell you.
Thank you.
Zero sum. That's how we look at it. Do the Chinese look at it that way? No. What they say is win-win. Now, maybe I'm naive,
Sure.
and I'm no expert in China. But what I just said about their non-expansionist, non-aggressive policies over the last couple of centuries should form a background to giving some credibility to
Sure.
them when they say, look, why can't it be a win-win? Now,
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. When Joe Biden was just 2 months in office, he gave an interview and he said, China's not going to be a superpower at our expense on my watch. Well, why does it have to be competition? Why can't it be win-win? Why can't we live in peace with China and with Russia as we pretty much did back in the 70s and 80s when we figured out, well, there was a balance of power and we didn't need to aggress one on the other. And so all I'm saying here is that my reading of Chinese foreign policy is don't mess in other people's affairs unless you're strategically threatened, unless you have a real threat like Putin does in Ukraine, and they live and let live. You know what's wrong with that? Now, what's wrong with that is that if you don't have tension, if you don't have, look at the Navy. The Navy needs to double its strength in the
Yeah.
Seventh Fleet. Yeah, and who profits from that? Well, it's the old Mickey Mouse, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. And when I say media, I say it in all caps, so to speak, because it's the linchpin. If you don't have if you don't
You
have
don't
the
have the
media,
narrative,
then you don't have enemies. Then you're going to have
the
the
never,
compelling need
the
to
endless war.
build. Yeah.
And I I'm like philosophically agree with everything you're saying. And maybe it's my own naivety as well. Why can't we live in harm? I mean, is that not the end goal of man, right? To find peace. I look at, again, just based on only I'm 31 years old, my limited experiences. I've interviewed Brigadier General Robert Spalding, who's a B-2 Spirit pilot. He was in Obama's National Security Council, and he wrote the book Stealth War. And it's about China's stated goals to replace America. They not to even replace America as the hegemon. They believe that they have been they are the global hegemon, and right now they're temporarily not in charge. And that is what their long-term goal is. And whereas we move in 4-year election cycles, they move in decades. And their plan is to, and it's hypocritical for me to sit here and like criticize it, right? I'm like, how dare you try to take over the world? That's what we do. Like it's what George Carlin said about the Germans. When is the last time America's bombed any white people? Germany. Why? Because Germany said we're going to take over the world. Bullshit. That's our fucking job. Like, so I also understand the hypocrisy of me saying, how dare they try to set up bases around the world? That's what we do, right? But that being said, there's also a gap between, what I want to happen. I wish we all held hands and had a cure for cancer. It's more so just removing myself and just looking at, from like the guests I've interviewed and the books I've read, it does seem like that is China's ultimate end goal. And if one of us is going to rule the world, I'd rather it be us, as I imagine that they're saying. If one of us is going to rule the world, I'd rather it be us. I'm with you. I don't like the idea of the perpetual war, the controlling the narrative. You got to have an enemy. If it's not Vietnam, if it's not Korea, if it's not Saddam, if it's not Osama, now it's the Russians. And then we're going to go to the Chinese. And after this, fuck it, we'll invade Mexico. You got to have the machine moving forever. And it's a destructive machine that absorbs all the world's resources. I'm not for that.
Well, let me pick up on
Sure.
Tom. Let me pick up on that because you just mentioned absorbing all the world's resources. And I would add attention. Um, Now, maybe it's because we have 10 grandchildren, but I have been calling the Ukraine crisis the mother of all opportunity costs.
Hmm.
We know what opportunity costs is. You spend billions for a fighter jet where you could be putting new schools in 3 states in
Yeah.
the Midwest. But the opportunity costs here, where attention, money is diverted from global warming,
Mm.
when not only that, but the biggest polluter in the world, the US Armed Forces
Hmm.
and other armed forces, are going in spades, where the Chinese are digging more coal than ever because their electricity is not so good, where we need to do something and quick to attenuate the effects of global warming. Uh, well, the mother of all opportunity costs is Ukraine, and it looks like it's going to be around for a while.
Yeah.
And so, whether it puts an end to all of us by reason of some really stupid person setting off a nuclear weapon, or whether it's kind of a more painful, slow-moving thing that deprives my grandchildren of fresh air, of clean water. Fresh air, I mean clean air and clean water. It's the existential thing where aren't we smart enough
Yeah.
to at least try out what the Chinese have suggested, and that is
You
win-win.
win.
Can't we just lay down our arms and meet these other crises, which are going to do us in inexorably unless we stop this other stuff? So,
Yeah.
mother of all opportunity costs. That's what I call Ukraine in a larger meaning of what's going on there.
Yeah. I mean, think about Eisenhower, right? That guy was no hippie. He was 5-star general, supreme allied commander, headed up the largest amphibious invasion in the history of man, set up the nuclear bunker system. What was his speech? For every battleship that's built, there's 1,000 brick schools that could have been built in cities. For every F-86 Sabre, there's enough food for a small town. For every new tank, we're not building homes for the elderly. And he
Mm.
said, in its ultimate sense, every bullet fired and weapon built is a robbery from those that are hungry and are not fed, those that are naked and not clothed, those that are homeless and not sheltered. And again, it's not Bernie Sanders, that's Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yeah, let me suggest at this point
Sure.
a principle that I like to evoke. It's called the Noah principle. It's very simple. No more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. We've been predicting a lot of rain here. What the hell are we going to do about this? Now, it's going to take more than what we've been doing. Inexorable is a lousy word, but unless we get off our rear ends, unless we do something with our bodies, this is not going to change.
Yeah.
Now, I've been beat up a lot of times. I've learned something from all that. Okay. I've learned that when old people get beat up, real old people, Americans seem to care about that. I mean, they just don't like old people get beat up. Okay. Young people, people like you in their 30s, I mean, comment to them, they're disruptive things, they have demonstrators, but old people. Okay. Now, I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to change this thing, to include put my body into it. And I've done that. I've been arrested many times, and I spent a couple of evenings, a couple of nights in
County
hellholes, like
jail. Yeah.
the one in what do they call it? The one under the Judiciary Building in bottom of Manhattan. The Tombs is what they appropriately call that. and DC jails that you wouldn't believe. So I know what that's like, and I
Yeah.
know, but it's a small price to pay. A couple days, and I haven't been beat up so bad that I haven't recovered. And people look at that and they say, "Well, he's an old guy. He cares so much. He seems to know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe he's onto something."
Yeah.
So not only old people, but people your age need to figure out how to build an ark and stop grousing about the rain. Now that's a little unkind. We have to expose the rain, and that's what
Sure.
we do first. We educate people, but then Cesar Chavez. You may not remember him, but he was a wonderful labor organizer out in California, great boycott and so forth. He used to always come up with this idea, let's, and they would say, "Oh no, no, can't do that. There's not enough of us." And Chavez used to say, "Look, there are enough of us. But if we don't do some action," he didn't say, "if we don't build some works, if we don't do some action, nothing's gonna happen. There are enough of us." And my favorite theologian, Annie Dillard, puts it this way. She says, "There's only us. There never has been any other. So what are we going to do? I mean, maybe we can dialogue a little bit on the steps that we can take before it's too late. Now, you're probably going to survive global warming, but your children, if you have any, won't. I mean, hello, doesn't that persuade us to lay down our arms and stop the pollution from our tanks and trucks and so forth? Well, if it doesn't, then it's their own damn fault. So we need to stop predicting rain. No, we keep predicting rain, but we also build some arcs. And that would be my appeal to any of the people watching this or listening. I figure out we're bright enough. I mean, you can't tell me we're not imaginative enough to stop this thing. And so I wish I had a prescription or some set of instructions or order. I don't, but I'm willing to do this. And we need everybody in on this act.
I think that will be the topic of the next episode, is what steps can people actually take. I was gonna say, kind of as a closing, because I gotta run in a minute, is I saw a great like take, I don't know, like a year ago, where somebody was like, the reason why humans fear sentient AI and or aliens with superior technology, the reason we fear them so much is why? Well, how will they treat us? And it's because we are projecting how we treat inferior animals. We treat them terribly. It's kind of the same thing. Again, you can see the irony. I'm like, how come I'm so against a global Chinese hegemon? Why? Because what if they build bases all around the world?
That's what we do.
That's our job. And it's like, well, now you have to wonder, well, how do they feel? Right? It's what if you and I are doing this interview and we're both Chinese farmers? We're probably going, let's go get ours. I think ultimately you're right, though. I mean, it will never stop. The boogeyman's been just around the corner. We nuked Nagasaki. It's over. If we just knock off the Soviets, then we're going to have world peace. And it's like decade, trillions of dollars. And it's like the game, it's not meant to be won. The people that are running the game, they don't want it to be won. They want it to go on for eternity. And the only way we can win it is like by not playing. It's a weird, right? It's like the movie, what was the movie War Games? What an interesting game. The only winning move is to not play. It's kind of like that. Mr. McGovern, we got to wrap this one up because I got another guest in a couple minutes. I'll put your website in the description as always, all your links and everything. I'm going to send you that book by David Vine. I think you would really, really like it. And I do hope to talk to you again. I think that would be another great episode, is if there are actionable steps people could take, because it's easy to listen to a podcast and go, yeah, lay down your arms. And then the podcast is over and you exit out and you don't do anything. Like, I think it would be interesting to see, like, are there steps people can take? to actually try to affect the building of the arcs instead of just screaming about the rain. I think that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, nice to be with you, Tom, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for coming on here, sir. Again, all of your links will be in the description as last time. I will email you this episode when it's up. We will schedule another one, and I'm going to make a note to send you that book right now. And can't wait to talk to you again, man.
Great. Thanks very much. Take care
Thank you,
now.
sir.